Today we will look at Crito, and in our reflection of Crito, we need to understand that Crito is one of the shortest dialogues of Plato, and it is the dialogue that is in between the apology or apologia and Phaedo. But this dialogue is a very interesting dialogue. Why? Because in Athens, you are not supposedly able to appeal the decision in court. And because you're not able to appeal any decision in court, that actually means that that when you are sentenced to death in Athens during that time, you cannot appeal it. You are dead immediately the next day. So that there is no opportunity that you should be in prison for a very long time, which we have seen in Crito. Crito supposedly happened at the time when Socrates was already in prison for almost 1 month before he is sentenced to death, which is Phaedo. But take note that at the beginning, it's very interesting that Crito is already inside the prison, and I'll discuss this in a bit. Let's talk first about what he's talking about. No, he will speak here of why he wasn't dead yet. In the footnote, you will see here about a ship that returned from Delos. It's footnoted here, but actually it can be seen more clearly not in Crito, but in another dialogue, which we will not read in so far, which is Phaedo. In Phaedo, Phaedo was talking to Echecrates, and let's read this dialogue. Were you with Socrates yourself, Phaedo, on the day when he drank the poison? I was there myself, Echecrates, says Phaedo. What are the things he said, blah, blah, blah. And then he asked, did you not even hear how the trial went? And now he's talking about the apology. Yes, someone did tell us about that. And we wondered that he seems to have died a long time after the trial took place. So see, even Echecrates was wondering why Socrates was not executed immediately after the trial. And Phaedo will explain. He says, it was by chance, Echecrates. The day before the trial happened, the prow or the stern of the ship that the Athenians sent to Delos has been crowned with garlands. So there is a ship that they already garlanded, and Echecrates asked, what ship is that? And then Phaedo explains. Let me delete the markings. He says, it is the ship, and this is where that note came from, no? From that you see in Crito. It is in Phaedo, in fact. It is the ship in which the Athenians say Theseus once sailed to Crete, taking with him the 2 lots of 7 victims. He saved them and was himself saved. The Athenians, since then, vowed to Apollo. So the story goes that if they were saved, they would send a mission to Delos every year. And from that time to this, they send such an annual mission to the god. They have a law to keep the city pure while it lasts. So after they have garlanded the ship, and they send the ship to Delos and then back, every year, they will not execute anyone. And he says, this can sometimes take a long time. So the mission begins when the priest of Apollo crowns the prow of the ship. And this happened, as I said, the day before Socrates' trial. That is why Socrates was in prison a long time between his trial and his execution. So that will explain, therefore, why Socrates was not immediately executed. And Crito as a dialogue, and if you're not yet executed, you know already the direct consequence of that. And what's the direct consequence of that? That Socrates was given enough time, sufficient time to escape from prison. But he did not escape. He did not escape. No? And that's something we need to pay attention to. Given the opportunity to escape, why didn't Socrates escape? Let's read the dialogue, and it begins with 43. Now, 43, this is the Stephanus numbers. And as I said, the Stephanus numbers is a standard way of numbering or referring to Platonic text, which was established by Henry Estienne or Stephanus. And this is like your verses in and chapters in an ordinary Bible. No? So when you say John 3:16, that's the same. Crito 43a will always be the start of Crito's text. And by now, since we've already read the Euthyphro and the Apologia, this would have been a more familiar way of referring you to the to any Platonic texts, no? Any Platonic texts. And that is what's really involved here. Let's begin our understanding of Crito. I would like to point your attention to the first part. Socrates wakes up and at very early in the morning, and Crito, his friend, is inside his cell. That is also weird, right? Because his friend can go in and go out his cell. What does that mean? That his friends can go in and go out his cell. That means that even Socrates can go in and go out of his cell also. No, that's what it means. And therefore, it's very important to know already at the beginning of Crito that the cage or the prison, the cell, is already open. He's like a bird whose cage door is already open. All he needed to do was to step out. Let's read the dialogue. Why have you come at this hour, Crito? Isn't it still early? It is indeed. About what time? Just before dawn. So before dawn, he was already there. And the Socrates says, I'm surprised the prison warden was willing to let you in. And then he says, he knows me by now, which tells you already that Crito must have been visiting Socrates very often. And then he says, and besides, here, pay attention, I've done him a good turn, which basically must have meant he had already paid Socrates. He must already have paid the warden, no? he must have already paid the warden, and because of that, the warden owes him a debt of gratitude of sort, and therefore allowed him inside. It's interesting. And then he says, so have you just arrived or have you been here for quite a while? And Crito said, for quite a while. So it seemed like Crito was watching. The file is in the canvas shell, no? In the material 0.2. It's in 0.2. One of the texts there that I have given the class. And then he says, then why didn't you wake me up? He says, in the name of Zeus, Socrates, I wouldn't do that, wake him up. But he would also say, I only wish I weren't so sleepless and distressed myself. So he says, Crito is sleepless and distressed, and yet he says, and that's why I'm so amazed to see how peacefully you were sleeping. See, that he himself was so worried about his friend, about the impending death, but Socrates, on the other hand, seemed to be the very opposite of his friend. No, in fact, later on we will even read that Socrates was even dreaming. You can just imagine. If you know you will die the next day, you will not be able to sleep already. But Socrates was resting peacefully. No? Amazing. And then he says, well, Crito, it would be an error for someone of my age to complain when the time has come when he must die, no? Because he was already 70 plus years old. That's why it's weird why he's already very old, and yet the people of Athens still cannot wait for him to die. They wanted him to die already, no? And yet he says, no. And then he says, why have you come so early? And then Crito says, I bring bad news, Socrates. Not bad in your view, it seems to me, but bad and hard in mine, and that all of your friends. What news is that? Has the ship returned? And then he says, no, it hasn't returned yet, but I think it will arrive today. So if he arrived, if he was there early in the morning, the ship will arrive that day. He will be executed the next day. That's what it means. How did he know that it will arrive to that day? There were reports that people had seen it in the Sunium. So what is the Sunium? So if this is Athens, mainland Athens, if Athens is here, Sunium is the tip of the territory of Athens. And they saw the ship at that point, and then by horse riding, they inform Athens that they have already saw the ship. That's why yesterday, that's why on that day, they know it will arrive in Athens. So it's the tip of the promontory of Athens. So it's clear that it will arrive that day. And so Socrates will die the next day. So Crito was there to convince Socrates for the last time to escape. So what we will hear is Crito's justification why Socrates should escape. That's why here he speaks of a dream, no? And remember, you only have a dream when you have a rapid eye movement in psychology or in dream studies. And rapid eye movement really means deep sleep, no? And in his dream, he thought of a beautiful, graceful woman robed in white who actually said to Socrates, You will arrive in Pythia on the third day. No? So eventually, he wanted Socrates to escape. And he will start laying down his 7 reasons. Yes, there are 7. Please bear with me. Why he should escape. Allow me to begin with the first one. And the first reason why Socrates should escape is because he is an irreplaceable friend. That's the first justification. He is an irreplaceable friend. Sometimes when you have a friend who will commit suicide, you'll tell that friend, don't commit suicide, you're irreplaceable. That's the first justification. You are difficult to find. I cannot find another friend like you. That's what it means to have an irreplaceable friend. That's the first reason, no? When you have a friend who will commit suicide, you'll tell them, don't go, you are irreplaceable, like that. So he tried to appeal to emotions. The second one is because he knew it will not work. He will say, not only will I lose a friend that I will never find again, he says, in addition, many people who don't know you or me well will think that I didn't care about you, since I could have saved you if I've been willing to spend money. So he says, the second thing, Socrates, is that what will people say about us, your friends? Will they say that we weren't willing to spend money to pay for your freedom? No? And here, he used the argument of the hoi polloi, or the majority or the many. That's why you will read here, many people. That's the hoi polloi. The hoi polloi is the majority. No? And so he will say, what reputation can be more shameful than being taught to value money than your friends? For many people won't believe that it was you who refused to leave this place, though we were urging you to do so. We've already paid people, but people will not say you do not want to go. So that's the first and the second. And then he says, you know, Crito, I don't really care what the hoi polloi think or what the majority think. I'm here, no? After all, the most decent ones who are worthier of consideration will believe that matters were handled in just the way they were in fact handled. And then he goes to continue asking, but you surely see, Socrates, that one should care about majority opinion too. Now you have to listen also what other people will think about your reputation. Your present situation shows clearly that the majority can do not just minor harm, but the very worst things, no? That the majority sentence you to death. You have to pay attention to that. And then Socrates would say, you know, Crito, the majority could do the very worst thing, but as it is, they cannot do neither. They can't make someone wise or unwise. No? Yes, they can harm my reputation, but it cannot make you wiser or not wiser. And so he says, well, okay, and this is the third justification. Maybe, Socrates, you're just worried about me and your friends and are fearing that if you escape, the informers here would give us the trouble and that we might force to give up all our property, pay heavy fines, and even suffer some penalty. The informers here, the Greek word is sycophants. That's the paid informers. And And he says, and this is the third reason, maybe you are afraid that your enemies will hire sycophants against us, will charge us trump up accusations like before. And he would say, do not worry. If they can pay, we can pay also. That's what he says. We're also rich. Don't worry. If they pay them, we will pay them back. Now, he says, take my advice. He says, take my advice and escape. And he will say again, then do not fear them. The sum of money that certain people I know will accept in order to save you and get you out of here isn't that large. No? Don't you see how cheap these informers are and how little money is needed to deal with them? My own wealth is available to you. No? And then he says, even if your concern for me makes you unwilling to spend my money, we already have friends like Simmias of Thebes or Sebes who already sent their money so that you would be free. And that's the reason why he says, we've even have friends in Thessaly, which is another Greek city that is important. And he says you can transfer to that Greek city if you really want to transfer. No, you can move there if you really want to move there. That's also okay. Okay? And then he says, okay, so first reason, we will lose an irreplaceable friend. Second reason, maybe you're just worried that we're worried that many people will say we valued money more than you, and therefore we, your rich friends, were not willing to spend money for you. Third reason, maybe you're just afraid about the sycophants. Maybe your enemies will hire sycophants against us. Don't worry, we can buy them back. And then fourth reason is the most important, and this is it. Throwing away your life when you could save it and hastening the very sort of fate for yourself that your enemies would hasten and indeed have hastened in their wish to destroy you. This is the justification that what Socrates is doing is a form of I forgot the charge. When you betray yourself, maybe it will come out in a bit, but it's a self-betrayal. He's basically saying, Socrates, you're doing precisely what your enemies are doing you. It's not arson. Arson is about burning something. It's at the tip of my tongue. I'll remember it later, what it's called. We have a national hero in the Philippines, Andres Bonifacio, who was charged of this very crime. Treason. Treason, you know. That's a betrayal against oneself. You know, that he was betraying himself by doing precisely what his enemies would have wanted him to do. No? And then the fifth is about the education of his children. That by dying, he is running away from his duty as a father. No, let's read that. What's more, I think you're betraying those sons of yours by going away and deserting them when you could bring them up and educate them there. He says, Socrates, it's your duty to educate your children. By the way, sycophants, this is the Greek term for sycophants. Sycophantay, no? Sycophants, no? They don't have a Y, right? But we do. So, sycophantay, that's also sycophants. These are the paid informers, no? Sycophantay. And then again, sixth reason, he says, but you seem to me, latter part, to be choosing the easiest way out. This is the sixth justification. What you're doing is contrary to your claim to value. If you claim that virtue, you have to be courageous by dying and choosing to die, you're not being courageous. And for that reason, you're not being virtuous. No? You're betraying yourself. No? You're acting contrary to virtue by staying. And then lastly, the seventh one is again an argument about his friends. I feel ashamed on your behalf and on behalf of myself and your friends. I fear that it's going to seem that this whole business has been handled with cowardice on our part. No, so this time, this one, the sixth one, it was about Socrates' virtue. The second one about the virtue of his friends, telling Socrates, people will say we're not virtuous, and therefore it will be contrary to us, and therefore not fair to us also. That's what he said. And we need to pay attention also at that movement, no? Of the 1 to 7 justifications. And Socrates will reply to that. He says, Crito, your enthusiasm most valuable provided it's of the right sort. But if it isn't, the greater it is, the more difficult it will be to deal with. No? Do not, we have a Filipino priest who said, don't ask if it's difficult. Ask if it's important. And so he says, we must therefore examine your arguments, whether we should do what you advise or not. You see, he says, I'm not the sort of person who just for now, the first time, persuaded by nothing within me, except the argument on the rational reflection seems best. So there, I will only accept it if the way you argue is good for me. And therefore, he says, I will not listen to it because it is simply stated by the hoi polloi. I will listen to it because it is the proper way of doing things. That's the contrast. No, I will not listen to the opinion of the majority. I will listen to what is appropriate or proper. So, what is the opinion of the majority? The opinion of the majority is that if your trial was unjust, it would have been properly normal for you to escape. Because you were falsely accused, then you can do an injustice of escaping because you were unjustly accused. That's the common sensibility, right? If I imprison you wrongly, then you can do also an injustice because people treated you unjustly. But Socrates says, but it's not, but that's a common opinion. I need to pay attention to what other people are saying, no? And we need to pay attention at that. So he says, suppose we first take up the argument about people's opinions or what other people would say. Then we need to ask ourselves, he says, when you listen, so he says, when you listen to other people's opinions, why are you listening to other people's opinion? No? Are we supposed to value good opinions and not bad ones? He says. And he says, we need to value good opinion. And Socrates provided two justification. And these are justifications pertaining to physical training, which are even health. He says, on matters of health and on matters of exercise, this is the two, or he combines it together on matters of physical training. Do you simply listen to, do you listen to all people, or do you listen only to the expert? Do you not listen to the doctor or the trainer, or do you listen to the hoi polloi, to every man? No? Do you listen to the hoi polloi, or do you listen only to the experts? And he says, on matters of health or on matters of exercise, you do not listen to the majority. You listen to the expert, right? And why is that? Because if you listen to the majority, what they say will cause more harm than they will more good. Let me give you an example. When I was before a seminarian, and in the Philippines, during community activities, we need to play basketball. But I'm only 5'4". That's my height, 5 feet 4 inches. So my classmates were very tall people. And at one point, they passed me the ball. I catch it wrongly. All my fingers were sprained. So I was sitting down with a very painful fingers until one brother said, you know, my grandmother taught me how to work with that. I will massage it. So he took my one finger, put oil, rotated it clockwise, counterclockwise, until he said he heard the vein returning to the original position. I didn't hear it, but he said he felt it. And he did it on all my fingers. The next day, my fingers were 3 times their sizes. All with edema. Because he rotated it clockwise and counterclockwise. And when they brought me to the doctor said, when there is a sprain, you should not touch it. Just allow it to heal first. Another example. I joined the Franciscan conventuals. And with the Franciscan conventuals, we have to play football because that's the game of the Italians. So we have superiors who coerce us, to play football with them. In the Philippines, the sport is really basketball, not football. But in other places, it's football, right? So we had the superior, we have to play football, but because we were Franciscans, we don't have shin guards. You know what a shin guard is? The shin guard here. And because we're used to playing basketball, we're not used to receiving balls on our head, or we're so afraid of the balls. So normally, if the ball is towards our face, we cover our face. And you know that if the ball touches the hand, that's a foul. So our superior, when we are guarding them very closely because they're already old, will stop the ball and then kick it towards our face. So we cover it, and that's penalty ball. And because it's penalty ball, they will kick. right? They will have to kick. So we have to stand covering our important parts, or we have to, because we have to create the wall, right? We have to create the wall to cover the important parts. But there was a time we had a superior who, while playing football, he stopped the ball and then kicked the ball, uh, fakely kicked the ball, and instead of kicking the ball, he kicked my shin. My shin. So I rolled in pain. And so I was limping, like Saint Ignatius maybe, after the cannonball incident, limping. And we had another brother who said, I know how to work with that because there's already a lamp here. So he took a bottle, put hot water, and then rub it against the shin. It was painful. Very painful. To the point that the next day, my leg was like double its size. Like an elephantiasis. Terrible. Then I learned what Socrates is talking about here. On matters of health, on matters of exercise, you need to listen to expert advice. Because if you disobey the person who will tell you the expert advice, it will destroy the body, or better yet, it will cause more harm. And when it causes more harm, he says, Socrates would say, when it causes harm, then a body that is destroyed is not worth living. So he says, no need to go through them all, but in cases of, and then he says, so if that's matter of health and exercise, and then he applies it, he says, applies the analogy, he says, on matters of just and unjust, shameful and fine, good and bad, who do you listen to? Do you listen to the majority, or do you listen to the expert? And then he says, because if we don't follow the expert, we shall seriously damage and maim that part in us which is made better by just, but is destroyed by the unjust. So he compared it, he compared his decision to the body, right? So he says, and then he says, so what does it destroy? The soul. If just and unjust is destroyed by, what is destroyed? The suke, or the psyche. Because the body is the soma, right? Body versus soul. So if you don't pay attention on matters of health and exercise, it will destroy the body. And a body that is destroyed is not worth living. How much more the soul? Come then, suppose we destroy that part of us which is made better by what's health, but is seriously damaged by the disease. We don't follow the opinion of people. What will happen to us? No? That's why he would say here, if our bodies are destroyed, then our lives are not worth living with the wretched and seriously damaged bodies. See? And then he says, but our lives are worth living when the part of us that's maimed by what's unjust and benefited by what's just is seriously damaged. All the more, it's not worth living. That's why he would say, then, my good friend, we should not give so much thought Then, my good friend, we should not give so much thought to what the majority of people will say about us, but think instead of what the people who understands just and unjust things will say. And that's the reason why we must, even if, he says, the majority can put us to death. So he says, and therefore the argument that living well and living a fine life, living justly are the same. Living justly are the same. So he says, therefore, we should not think about escaping, or we should not think about what the majority of people are saying, no? But instead should only pay attention on what is good and what is proper. From here, Socrates will give two justifications. I'll just, due to the request for a break, we'll just go for a 10-minute break, and after 10 minutes, we will resume the recording. So he gave two justifications. Whether he says we can oppose anything, no? And he will now focus on two principles which I think are very important. And we find the two principles in 49b. In 49b, we can read here, no one should never do injustice. That's the first principle. So one shouldn't do injustice in return for injustice, as majority of people think, seeing that one should never do injustice. So even if the trial was unjust, it is not a justification to do another unjust thing, which is escaping, for example. So Socrates is saying at all times, it is not correct to do an injustice. In an age where vengeance is almost the most usual way of moving forward, we read in Crito that in no way should we return an injustice for an injustice. So, and he will explain. He says, so what about when someone does wrong in return for having suffered wrongdoing? Is that just or not? It's not. For there's no difference, he says, between doing wrong and doing injustice. So Socrates would say, one must neither do injustice in return nor wrong any man, no matter what one has suffered at his hands. And Crito, in agreeing to this, watch out that you're not agreeing to anything contrary to what you believe. You see, I know that only a few people do believe or will believe, and between those who believe it and those who don't, there's no common basis for deliberation. And so he says, and that's what we need to pay attention to. We need to understand that this is not simply an issue of retaliating, no? And when you reflect on it, that's true. If a person hurt me now, that person who hurt me now has a particular mental condition, has a pattern of thinking and things like that, which might not be their pattern of thinking or condition when I do an injustice to them. And therefore, I do not really harm the very person who harmed me, but somebody else. And there he says, why? Because the goal of life, and let me just go up a little bit, he would say, because the goal of life is not simply to live, but to live well there. Here, let me bring you back to 48b And here you see a line that I love so much about Crito. The most important thing isn't living. It's easy to be alive, but it's a question of living well. It's a question of, am I living well? No? Am I able to live well? That's the question we need to pay attention to. Am I living well? And that's a quotable quote already, no? It's from Crito 48b. The question is not simply about being alive, no? So he can be alive, but if he didn't live well, that's another issue, no? Remember, if a body was injured because of wrong treatment, the illness will come out in the body. And that's why Socrates would say, a person who did wrong unjustly, and destroys his soul, that person, that ruined soul, will come out in his engagement with others. People will know your brokenness. People will see the broken soul. That's what he says. That's why he says, no one should do injustice. And the second argument is this. It's in 49e. Then I'll state the next point, and this is the second argument. Should one do the things one has agreed with someone to do, provided they are just, or should one cheat? No? Which basically is translated with, just agreements ought to be fulfilled. Which means if the agreement is just, you need to uphold it. You need to keep it, because the agreement is just. And what agreement is he talking about here? Well, he's talking about his agreement with Athens, that for all his life, he accepted tacitly. No? Tacitly means indirectly. He accepted indirectly the laws of Athens, never plead for it to be changed, and things like that. Tacitly, he agreed with it. And because he agreed with it tacitly, he needs to subject himself to it. You will not want to change the rules of the game while you are playing the game. Instead, you change the rules of the game after the game for the next game. Which is really saying, you know, Socrates, you stayed with Athens for almost 70 years. You never questioned this law. And now that you are subjected to this law, you question it. That's not fair. No, that's not fair. And according to him, just agreements, and remember, there's a condition. Not all agreements has to be upheld. Only just agreements. No? Only agreements that are just. That's why just agreements ought to be upheld. And that's the reason why he says, when I escape from prison, who am I hurting? Am I hurting the people who sentenced me to death? Or am I hurting Athens that served as my home? And Socrates said, I'm hurting Athens. No longer the people, no longer the people who actually hurt me. And then the succeeding parts of the dialogues are just monologues where he actually started talking about the personification of the laws of Athens, where he says, even if you escape from this life, from our cousins there, in the next life, our cousins, the laws will haunt you. We're not really sure whether that's true, but whether you like it or not, that's the world that Socrates was working on. And it is that so he says And I bring you back to 48b because that's a very important line, and I hope you have marked it in your copies, because he will say there, it's not living, but living well. That's the reason why Crito is a good essay in ethics or morality. And also here, he gave two principles for his actions. You should always do good at all costs. And second, just agreements ought to be fulfilled.